Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAsperger'sChat.com, and today I want to talk about impaired social interaction in people on the autism spectrum, and this may help you understand why you don't get the emotional reciprocity that you need, want, and desire from your spouse on the spectrum. So there's various theories as to why people on the autism spectrum have impaired social skills. Some researchers suggest that poor social skills can be caused by a weakness or an absence of the social gaze response, and we'll talk about that here shortly. It may be caused by sensory distractions, which prevent the person from concentrating on social issues. Could be caused by memory dysfunction. For example, deficits in memory for faces and common social scenes, which prevent the person from remembering other people or events. It could also be caused by failure to develop a theory of mind, which prevents the person from understanding what other people are thinking or feeling. And lastly, it might be caused by failure of affective processing. Affective processing simply means being able to understand one's emotions and perhaps the emotions in others. So people on the autism spectrum, with respect to social interactions, have difficulty with social responses. Specifically, they tend to be inflexible, they tend not to understand context, and they tend to have difficulty generalizing. So let me explain this in more detail. The relationship between social interactions and proper social responses are flexible, context-dependent, and generalizable. For example, general and unspoken social rules are supposed to govern how a person responds when he or she meets someone for the first time. But the specifics of the meeting are never precise and depend on the context. For example, whether the new acquaintance is a neighbor, a teacher, a classmate, a coworker, etc. Another example would be, let's say family members get together for a family reunion, okay? So there's no doubt going to be handshakes, hugs, and kisses, but exactly how tight a hug will be, or exactly where a kiss will be planted, or exactly what people will be talking about is both variable and context dependent. Neurotypicals can intuitively interact with others in a way that is flexible. Variability does not throw them off. They understand the context of the social event, and they can generalize from one event to another event. But people on the autism spectrum have difficulty in these areas. The subtle nuances in relationships are difficult. So what does the individual on the spectrum do instead? They tend to learn things, especially social things and emotional things, by rote memory. The person's style of learning is such that he or she will try to store each social experience by rote memory. A strong aptitude for rote memory is a typical cognitive tendency among people on the autism spectrum. For example, these individuals may demonstrate the ability to repeat the script of an entire movie verbatim, or recall specific dates that nobody else is even considering. However, this capacity for strong rote memory may also be accompanied by challenges in simple recall. For example, you may have talked to your spouse earlier one morning and you asked him to do something, and then 2 or 3 hours later you asked him if he followed through. He said no, and I don't even remember what you asked me to do. Yet he may be able to mention all of the generals in the Civil War, for example. So while rote memory helps one retain data and facts, it doesn't help with gauging the give and take aspects of social interactions. Without extracting complex social cues from multidimensional social interactions, the person on the autism spectrum can't effectively use the stored information to generalize to new related social situations. The best that person can do is to follow rigidly the memory entry that best matches the current situation as a script. Many of you have heard of Temple Grandin. She's an autistic author, and she wrote about how she handled social situations better as she got older because she accumulated more examples in her visual library and could find a better match to each social situation. Here's another example of the business of using rote memory. Since social responses tend not to be flexible, context dependent or generalizable in the person on the autism spectrum. Let's say, for example, we have a college student, and we have, in this case, he or she is a neurotypical, and so this person is sitting in class, and so by observing his professor's behavior, which is called gaze attention, the non-autistic or neurotypical student is usually able to predict the professor's intentions. For example, what the teacher is going to do next, what he might say next, and so on. So as a result, this student may get a pencil and piece of paper from his desk. He may raise his hand to ask a question. He may open a certain textbook, or simply sit quietly without taking any action. Exactly what will happen is variable and depends on the context. For example, whether the professor is writing something on the blackboard, is looking at the group of students with her arms crossed, or has moved from her desk to the classroom exit. Conversely, the autistic student, by virtue of a rote learning style, attempts to store each instance separately and precisely and fails to extract the ambiguous, context-dependent relationship between the professor's body language and her intention. Now, I had mentioned earlier that one reason for poor social skills may be a weakness or absence of the social gaze response. Now, what people on the autism spectrum tend to do instead of that is gaze aversion. So compared to neurotypical people who look at others' faces, especially the eyes, people on the autism spectrum do this much less frequently, and that's called gaze aversion. So one reason for their gaze aversion is that the relationship between facial expression and the other person's feelings or motives is hard for the person to comprehend. One of the traits of autism is difficulty understanding facial cues, body language, how tone of voice and volume of voice changes the context. So if the person can't glean nonverbal information provided in facial expressions, then he or she will be less interested in looking at the faces of others, which further reduces his or her chance of gleaning important nonverbal information in social interactions. Another reason for gaze aversion is that the human face is very complex. It's a dynamic stimulus that may overload the sensory sensitivities of the person trying to observe the other's behavior. And this makes it very difficult to read another person's facial expressions, body language, and so on. So it is for these reasons that your spouse on the autism spectrum has impaired social interaction, and unfortunately in the NT's mind, this often downloads as he is selfish, insensitive, uncaring, self-absorbed, even narcissistic. And I'm not saying that none of that happens ever, but a good 80% of what's going on here is simply this business of not instinctively and intuitively and naturally getting into the flow, especially the emotional flow of social interactions.